The first scent was ozone, sharp and clean as a lightning strike. The second was blood. Alara stood on her porch in the pre-dawn gray. The worn would cool beneath her bare feet. Before her, in the dusty paddock that held the last of her flock, stood the beast the whole valley had called a curse. Jericho, the feral donkey, was a statue of scarred gray hide and defiant stillness. His great, long-eared head was low, his breath pluming in the chill. At his feet, crumpled like a discarded coat, lay the body of a timber wolf, its neck broken. The sheep, her precious, dwindling sheep, were huddled behind him, a trembling wall of wool and quiet panic. They were all there. She counted them in the half-light, her heart a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. 27 ewes, 41 lambs. The same number she had counted into the paddock last night. Not one was missing. Not one was harmed. The arithmetic was sound. For weeks, the wolf had been a ghost, a rumor of gleaming eyes and stolen lambs that haunted every rancher in the valley. It had taken 2 from Jebediah's flock, 4 from the Miller boys. It had taken 3 of hers before she'd started moving the flock into the paddock by the barn each night. And now it was here, dead at the feet of an animal she had been told would kill them himself. The town's verdict echoed in her mind, a chorus of spitting, whiskered men around the stove at the general store. A woman alone can't run a sheep ranch. That beast is a demon. Ought to be shot. She'll lose it all. Mark my words. She looked at Jericho. He lifted his head, his dark, liquid eyes finding hers across the 50 yards of trampled dust. He did not move. He simply stood his ground, the guardian no one believed in, over the flock no one thought she could keep. He was ridiculous and magnificent, a creature of profound and stubborn dignity. A quiet breath escaped her lips, a prayer of thanks to a god she wasn't sure she knew. It had worked. 2 years earlier, the donkey was just a story told to frighten children, a phantom of the dry hills that bordered her uncle's forgotten parcel of land. That was when Alara arrived, a single carpet bag in her hand and a deed in her pocket, to claim the 80 acres of rock and thistle willed to her by a man she'd barely known. The land was poor, the small flock of sheep riddled with foot rot, and the cabin leaned as if tired of standing upright. The welcome from the town of Promise was just as thin. They saw a young woman, alone, with hands too soft for the work ahead. They saw a fool. Marcus Thorne, the regional cattle and wool agent, had seen an opportunity. He'd met her on her second day, his buggy kicking up a cloud of proprietary dust. He was a man built of soft handshakes and hard calculations. A sad business, your uncle, he'd said, his eyes scanning the dilapidated fences, the scrawny sheep. This is hard country for a man, let alone, well, I could take the flock and the land off your hands. Give you enough for a fresh start somewhere more suitable. She had looked at his polished boots, and then at the land, her land, and said, I think I'll make my start here. His smile was a thin, pitying thing. The mockery started then, dressed as concern. It was in the way the men at the store fell silent when she entered, the way the other ranchers' wives offered condolences as if she were already defeated. But Alara had a quiet, deep-rooted stubbornness her uncle would have recognized. She learned the rhythms of the place. She rose before the sun, her hands slowly hardening, cracking, becoming as tough as old leather. She learned the language of the sky, the smell of rain on dry dirt, the way the wind spoke of the changing seasons. She treated the foot rot, mended the fences, and began the slow, brutal work of clearing thistle. And she learned about the predators. The coyotes were clever thieves, but it was the lone wolf that was the real threat, a swift and silent reaper. Her flock, small as it was, began to shrink. The arithmetic of survival became her nightly meditation. So many sheep, so much wool, so many months until shearing. The numbers were unforgiving. One evening, sitting with old man Svensson, her only real neighbor, a Norwegian immigrant whose farm was as neat and stoical as he was, she confessed her fears. He listened, his pale blue eyes fixed on the distant hills. The land provides the problem, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. But it also provides the answer. You must only learn to see. It was Srensen who first told her the donkey's story not as a haunting, but as a history. The beast was a descendant of the burros the old prospectors had used, gone wild for generations. He was bigger, smarter, and meaner than any jack they'd ever seen. He'd broken traps, kicked down fences, and evaded every man who tried to hunt or capture him. He was, Srensen said with a glimmer of admiration, a survivor. They say he hates sheep, she'd offered. Srensen had shrugged, packing his pipe. They say many things. A thing is not what people say it is. A thing is what it does. The idea took root in her mind, a seed of desperate, illogical hope. A guard dog cost money she did not have. A rifle meant sleepless nights she could not afford. But the donkey was free. If she could catch him. The next day, she started. She didn't take a rope or a gun. She took a bucket of fresh water and a handful of oats, and she walked toward the hills where he was sometimes seen, a gray ghost against the brown landscape. The men at the store heard about it within a day. The laughter was loud and cruel. She's gone to tame the devil's own mule. More likely it'll tame her. With its hooves, she heard the talk, but she did not answer it. Being right, she was beginning to learn, was its own kind of reply. And it did not need to be spoken aloud. She just had to earn it. For the first week, she saw nothing but hoof prints, large and cloven, pressed deep into the dry soil. She found the spot he favored, a small, hidden basin with a seep of bitter water and a bit of tough grass. She left the oats on a flat rock and poured the fresh water into a hollow. Then she retreated to a ridge 200 yards away and sat, perfectly still, until the sun began to dip below the horizon. She did this every day. The town's amusement turned to a kind of morbid pity. They saw her walking toward the hills each afternoon and shook their heads. Thorn stopped by again. This is becoming a spectacle, Elara. People are worried for you. Sell to me. It's a kindness. To yourself, his kindness felt like a trap. I'm fine, Mr. Thorn, she said, her voice even. Just gonna know my property. On the 8th day, she saw him. He was bigger than the stories. His coat was the color of dust and shadow, crisscrossed with old scars. One ear had a tear in it. He stood on the far ridge of the basin, watching her, his stillness a challenge. He was magnificent. He watched her for an hour before melting back into the landscape. He did not go near the oats or the water, but he had seen her. The next day, he was closer. The day after that, closer still. She never moved toward him. She just sat, a quiet, unthreatening presence. It became a ritual, a silent conversation. She was a fixture in his world now, as regular as the sun. On the 14th day, after she had retreated to her ridge, he walked cautiously down into the basin. He sniffed the oats, his great head low. He drank from the water she'd brought, long, deep draughts. It was a victory so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She kept it to herself, a secret joy banked like a coal under ash. The process took a month. Every day, a little closer. Every day, a little more trust, earned through the currency of absolute consistency. She began to speak to him, her voice low and calm, telling him about her day, about the sheep, about the failing pump on her well. She gave him a name, Jericho. For the walls of mistrust she hoped to bring down not with a shout, but with patience. The day he followed her home, the town saw. He stayed 100 yards behind her, a watchful shadow, all the way to her property line. He stopped there, at the fence he could have easily destroyed, and watched her walk to the cabin. The laughter in town died that week. It was replaced by a confused, grudging silence. Old man Srensen came by that evening. He saw the donkey standing just beyond the fence, a silent sentinel. He nodded slowly, a rare smile cracking the weathered landscape of his face. Patience is a language beasts understand, he said, his voice soft. A stubborn heart speaks to a stubborn heart. He was not waiting to be caught. He was waiting to be asked. Jericho did not come inside the fence for another week. He patrolled the perimeter, a self-appointed warden. The coyotes, who had grown bold, stopped coming near. Their nightly yips and howls grew more distant. Elara's lamb count held steady. It was the first time the arithmetic had been on her side. Inside the cabin, late at night, she would light the lamp and look out the window, and in the moonlight, she would see his shape, solid and reassuring, standing between her flock and the darkness. He was not a pet. He was not broken. He was a treaty, an agreement between two stubborn, lonely creatures on a piece of hard land. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Elara felt she was no longer entirely alone. She was beginning to understand what Svensson meant. The land had provided the answer. It was just wilder and stranger than anyone else had been willing to see. The donkey's integration into the farm was a slow, deliberate dance. Elara never pushed. She would leave the paddock gate open when she was nearby, and one afternoon, Jericho simply walked in. The sheep, sensing his quiet authority, parted for him. He moved among them not as a predator, but as a sovereign. He ignored them with a regal disinterest that was more reassuring than any affection would have been. He drank from their trough, his presence so immense and calm that even the skittish ewes did not shy away. His loyalty, she learned, was not to the sheep themselves, but to the territory she had defined. He was guarding his home, and they were simply the residents he tolerated. Yet, a strange tenderness began to emerge. She saw him use his great head to nudge a wandering lamb back toward its mother. She saw him stand over a ewe during a difficult birth, his body a shield against the wind. The town watched, baffled. The beast that was supposed to trample her flock was acting like a fussy nanny. The humor of it was a gentle, private thing that warmed Elara through the long days of labor. A boy from town, Finn, started appearing. He was a slip of a thing, maybe 12 years old, with eyes that saw everything and a mouth that said little. He came from a hardscrabble family with too many children and not enough kindness. He would sit on the fence for hours, watching Elara work, watching the donkey. He never asked for anything. One day, Elara was struggling to reset a fence post, the dry ground refusing her shovel. Finn slid off the fence. "I can hold it steady," he said, his voice barely a whisper. And so began another treaty. Finn became a regular presence, helping with chores that required a second pair of hands. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his small frame wiry and strong. He was the first person, other than Elara, to speak the donkey's name. "Jericho looks thirsty," he'd say, and they would haul water together. The donkey tolerated the boy, sensing perhaps that Finn, like him, was a creature accustomed to watching from the edges. The farm began to change. With the predators held at bay, the flock flourished. The lambs grew fat and healthy. The ewes, unstressed, produced thicker, richer wool. The arithmetic began to look less like survival and more like prosperity. By the time shearing season arrived, Elara's flock was the healthiest in the valley. Marcus Thorne returned. The pity was gone from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, acquisitive gleam. He walked through her flock, his hands assessing the quality of the wool. "I'm surprised," he said, a statement that was both a compliment and an insult. "You've done better than expected." He made his offer for the wool clip, a price that was insultingly low, the same price he offered the ranchers with their scrawny, stressed flocks. "It's a fair price," he said smoothly. Given the market, Elara had done her own arithmetic. She knew what good wool was fetching from mills. She looked him in the eye, her composure unsettling him. "My price is 10 cents a pound higher," Thorne laughed, a short, barking sound. "Be reasonable, Elara. A thing is only worth what others will pay. And I'm the only buyer for 100 miles. Then I suppose I won't be selling today," she replied, her voice calm and final. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the dust, his mouth agape. His shock was a small, satisfying victory. He left, his buggy throwing up angry plumes of dirt. The story was all over town by nightfall. Elara had defied Marcus Thorne. The consensus was that she was a fool. She had no way to get her wool to another market. She would be ruined by her own pride. For 2 weeks, the neatly tied sacks of wool sat in her barn, a testament to her stubbornness. The weight of her decision pressed on her. The arithmetic was stark. Without the wool money, she couldn't afford the winter feed. Doubts, cold and sharp, pricked at her in the quiet hours of the night. Had she made a mistake? Had pride undone all her hard work? One afternoon, a long, low wagon pulled by 4 stout mules rumbled up her lane. It was a freight wagon, the kind that ran the long routes to the cities in the east. The driver was a man she'd never seen before, his face weathered by sun and wind. He introduced himself as a drover, moving supplies for the railroad. "I heard a story in town," he said, nodding toward her barn, "about a woman with a flock of sheep and a ghost donkey. He'd been a sheepman himself once." He asked if he could see her flock. Alara led him to the pasture. He was silent for a long time, his expert eye taking in the healthy ewes, the sturdy lambs, and Jericho, who watched them both from a distance. "They're clean," the drover said, his voice filled with respect. "No sign of stress. I haven't seen a flock this calm in years." He looked at Jericho. "I've heard of this. Back in the old country, they'd sometimes run a jack with the flock. Said a good one was worth 3 dogs and a rifle. Never saw it myself until today." He asked to see her wool. He ran his hands through it, tested its strength, noted its cleanliness and long staple. He looked at her. "The agent in town, Thorne, he's a thief. He's been skimming profits from this valley for a decade. What was your price?" She told him. He nodded. "That's a fair price. I'll take it all, and I'll pay in cash." The transaction was simple and direct. The drover and his team loaded the wool onto the wagon. He counted out the money into her hand, more than she had ever held in her life. As he was leaving, he paused. "Next year I'll be back, and I'll bring friends. There's always a market for quality." When she went into town for supplies the next day, the silence was different. It was no longer pitying or mocking. It was the sound of grudging respect. She had faced down Marcus Thorne and won. She had proven that a thing's worth wasn't set by the local bully, but by its own quality. She had done it alone. Or rather, alone with a quiet boy, a wise old neighbor, and a feral donkey nobody else had wanted. The success of the wool sale changed the texture of Alara's life. For the first time, the arithmetic wasn't about scarcity, but about planning. She bought a new pump for the well, a better grade of winter feed, and 2 young rams to improve her bloodline. For Finn, she bought a sturdy pair of boots and a book about animal husbandry, which he read by her lamplight in the evenings, his brow furrowed in concentration. For herself, she bought nothing but the quiet satisfaction of proving them all wrong. The respect she'd earned was fragile, though. In a small town, envy often follows success. The talk shifted. She wasn't a fool anymore. She was lucky. The donkey was a fluke. The drover was a one-time bit of good fortune. They were waiting for her to fail, because her success was a quiet indictment of their own lack of imagination. Old man Svensson warned her. "They forgive a person for being poor," he'd rumbled one evening, watching the heat lightning flash over the distant mountains. "They do not forgive a person for being right when they were wrong." He looked at the sky, his eyes narrowed. It was a clear, merciless blue. "The sky is too clean," he murmured. "The creek is too low. This will be a hard summer." His words were prophetic. The spring rains never came. By June, the pastures were turning a pale, sickly yellow. By July, the creek that ran through the valley had slowed to a muddy trickle. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, the sun a white-hot coin in a hazy sky. The drought settled over the land, a slow, suffocating blanket. The other ranchers grew desperate. Their shallow wells ran dry. Their pastures burned to dust. The sheep grew thin, their wool brittle. They began selling off their stock to Marcus Thorne for pennies on the dollar, just to cut their losses. He moved through the valley like a vulture, his face a mask of false sympathy as he capitalized on their ruin. He came to Alara's ranch, his buggy looking impossibly black against the bleached landscape. "The drover won't be coming back for you this year, Alara," he said, his voice oozing concern. "There's no good wool left in this valley but yours. And your luck with water won't last forever. Sell your flock to me now, while they're still worth something." He gestured to her pasture, which, while not lush, was still green in patches. "It's your only choice," but he was wrong. It was not luck. It was observation. In the long, quiet months of taming Jericho, she had walked every inch of her 80 acres. She had learned its secrets. In a rocky, scrub-choked basin her uncle had always considered useless, she had found a deep, slow-seeping spring fed by an underground aquifer. It wasn't a gushing fountain, but a steady, reliable source of clean water. It was the reason Jericho had favored the spot. He had known all along. While the other ranchers had let their thirsty herds trample their riverbanks into mud, Alara had spent the spring and early summer carefully piping water from her hidden spring to her troughs, conserving every drop, rotating her flock to prevent overgrazing. She had been preparing for the hard summer Svensson had predicted. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice betraying none of the cold fury she felt. "But my flock is not for sale." His mask of concern slipped. "You're a fool, woman. When that spring of yours dries up and the wolves get hungry, don't come crying to me." The wolves were the other face of the drought. With their usual prey, rabbits and deer, thinned by the lack of forage, they grew bolder, more desperate. They began to hit the weakened flocks of the other ranchers, not just at night, but in broad daylight. The valley was gripped by fear. Jebediah, her proudest, most dismissive neighbor, was hit the hardest. He lost nearly half of his flock in a single, brutal raid. He was a broken man, his decades of work wiped out in a matter of weeks. Alara's ranch became an island of green in a sea of brown, her flock the only healthy one for miles. Her quiet competence was no longer a subject of gossip. It was a source of bitter resentment. They didn't understand how she was doing it, and they hated her for it. Only Svensson understood. "You listen to the land," he said, nodding toward her spring. They only ever tried to command it. Finn worked tirelessly by her side. They dug a second holding tank to store the spring's overnight flow, ensuring not a drop was wasted. The boy's silence was a comfort, his presence a bulwark against the weight of the valley's animosity. One evening, as they watched the sheep drink, he spoke. "They're scared," he said, not looking at her. "My pa says you made a deal with the devil. For the water." And for Jericho, Alara looked at the donkey, who stood watching the perimeter, his torn ears silhouetted against the blood-red sunset. "Jericho isn't the devil, Finn. He's just stubborn, and he knows what's worth protecting." The crisis came to a head on a moonless night in late August. A hot, dry wind rattled the windows of the cabin. Alara couldn't sleep. The air felt charged, expectant. She had counted the flock into the paddock near the barn, the same routine as always. But tonight felt different. A low growl from the darkness jolted her. It wasn't the yip of a coyote. It was deeper, more menacing. It was the lone wolf, the big one, driven from the high country by hunger. She grabbed her lantern and her uncle's old shotgun, her heart pounding. As she stepped onto the porch, she saw him. He was a massive shadow, slipping through a section of fence he dug under. The sheep screamed, a wave of pure terror, and scrambled to the far side of the paddock. But Jericho did not run. He moved to intercept the wolf, placing his body between the predator and the flock. He lowered his head and let out a bray that was not the sound of a farm animal, but a raw, primordial roar of fury. It was a sound that shook the very foundations of the night. It was the blast of a trumpet before a wall came tumbling down. The fight was a storm of dust and fury under the swinging light of Alara's lantern. The wolf was a blur of speed and slashing teeth, a creature of pure, desperate hunger. It lunged, aiming for the donkey's throat. But Jericho was not a sheep. He met the attack not with fear, but with a surprising, brutal agility. He spun, his hind legs lashing out with the force of twin pistons. The sound of hoof connecting with ribs was a sickening crack that echoed across the yard. The wolf yelped, thrown back, but its desperation was greater than its pain. It came again, lower this time, trying to hamstring him. Jericho reared, his front hooves striking down like hammers, his teeth, large and yellow, bared in a terrifying grimace. He was not a gentle guardian now. He was a warrior defending his territory. Alara stood frozen on the porch, the useless shotgun in her hands. She couldn't get a clear shot without risking Jericho. All she could do was watch the primal battle unfold, a clash between two wild, stubborn hearts. The wolf, bleeding and battered, made one last, frantic lunge. It was a mistake. Jericho caught the wolf by the scruff of its neck, his powerful jaws clamping down. He lifted the predator clear off the ground, shaking it with a terrible, violent force, and then threw it aside. The wolf landed in a heap, its neck broken. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and Jericho's harsh, ragged breathing. He stood over the body of his vanquished foe, his scarred gray hide dark with sweat and flecked with blood, his sides heaving. Then he slowly, deliberately walked to the center of the paddock, nudged a frightened lamb with his nose, and stood his ground, a silent, unmovable monument. The sheep, their panic subsiding, began to press in around him, finding safety in his solid, unyielding presence. Alara finally lowered the shotgun, her arms trembling. The arithmetic was still sound. The flock was safe. The beast everyone had called a monster had been their salvation. The story of the fight was all over the valley by noon the next day. Finn, who had heard the commotion from his own home a half-mile away, had been the first to arrive at dawn, his eyes wide with awe at the scene in the paddock. The dead wolf was undeniable proof. The mockery and resentment Alara had faced curdled into a stunned, fearful respect. She had water in a drought, a thriving flock in a famine, and a guardian who could kill a wolf with its bare teeth and hooves. She had become a figure of myth, a woman who didn't just survive the hard land, but seemed to have it under her command. But Alara felt no triumph. She felt only the deep, bone-weary ache of responsibility. That afternoon, Jebediah appeared at her gate. His pride was gone, stripped away by grief and ruin. He was a stooped, defeated man. He did not look at her, but at the dust at his feet. "My well is dry," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "My last few ewes, they're going to die." He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a shame that was painful to witness. "I know what we all said about you. I was wrong. I'm asking, can I water my flock at your spring? I'll pay." Here it was, the moment of her true victory or her true failure. She held all the power. She could refuse him. She could gouge him, charge him a ruinous price for the water, just as Thorn would have done. She could make him pay for every jeer, every dismissive word. The thought was bitter and tempting. She looked past him, at her own flock, safe and content around the quiet donkey. She thought of Srenson's words, "A thing is what it does." What kind of person was she going to be? "You don't have to pay me, Jebediah," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended. "Bring your flock over. There's enough water for all of us." He stared at her, uncomprehending. "But why?" "Because we're neighbors," she said simply, "and the drought is enemy enough." He began to weep, silent, racking sobs that shook his entire body. Alara opened the gate for him. He was the first. By the end of the week, 3 other families had come to her, humbled and desperate. She made the same offer to each of them. They could water their flocks at her spring. In return, when the drought broke and their flocks recovered, they would give her a share of their new lambs. It was not charity, it was a compact. It was the arithmetic of community, not just survival. They grazed their combined flocks on her land, the animals mixing together, a symbol of the new treaty being forged. Marcus Thorn arrived, his face livid with rage. He saw the valley's remaining sheep, all gathered on her land, drinking her water. He had been counting on their destruction to force their sale. "What is this?" he snarled. "You can't just give it away. Water is a commodity. You're ruining the market." "It's my water, Mr. Thorn," Alara said, Jericho moving to stand quietly beside her, a subtle and effective threat. "And these are my neighbors. I'll have the land commission on you," he threatened. "That spring is likely on common land. I'll see you ruined for this." But Old Man Srenson was already there, a sheaf of old papers in his hand. "The original survey maps," he announced, his voice carrying in the still air. "From the founding of the county. The spring is well within the boundaries of this property. Always has been." He fixed Thorn with his pale blue eyes. "A thing is not what people say it is, Mr. Thorn. It is what it is. And you are a thief." Thorn was exposed. His power, built on intimidation and the exploitation of hardship, evaporated under the clear light of day and the quiet solidarity of his intended victims. He left, his threats turning to dust in his mouth. He had lost his hold on the valley. Alara had broken it not with anger or revenge, but with a simple act of generosity. The day the drought broke, The sky was a bruised purple. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth for the first time in months. Then the rain came, not a furious downpour, but a slow, steady, soaking rain that fell for 3 straight days. It was as if the land itself was taking a long, deep drink. The valley began to heal. The creek beds filled, the grass sent up tentative green shoots, and a sense of hope, fragile but real, returned. Alara's ranch became the nexus of this recovery. The shared flocks, healthier for having survived the drought, formed the foundation of the valley's new prosperity. The ranchers, bound by their shared hardship and her generosity, formed a cooperative. When the drover returned the following spring, as promised, he found not a single woman holding out against a predatory agent, but a unified front of producers with high-quality wool and a fair, set price. They cut out Marcus Thorne for good. His power in the region dwindled to nothing. A cautionary tale told about a man who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. Alara never spoke of her victory. She didn't have to. It was visible in the greening pastures, in the healthy flocks, and in the way the townspeople now met her eyes. They no longer saw a foolish woman alone. They saw the woman who had saved them. The respect they gave her was quiet, deep, and earned. Finn stayed on, no longer a visitor, but a part of the farm. He was learning the work, his quiet competence a mirror of her own. She was teaching him not just about sheep, but about the arithmetic of kindness, about how a community could be stronger than the sum of its parts. He was the future of the place, and she knew it. One cool evening in the new green of the world, she stood with Old Man Svensson on her porch, watching the flocks graze peacefully. Jericho was among them, a placid gray mountain in a sea of white wool. He was a local legend now, the guardian of Promise Valley, but to Alara, he was just Jericho, stubborn, scarred, and loyal. "You have done a good thing here," Svensson said, his pipe smoke curling into the twilight. "You have taught them that wealth is not a thing you hoard, but a thing you grow." Together, Alara watched Jericho nudge a lamb that had strayed too far, his gesture so impossibly gentle for such a formidable creature. She thought of the long, lonely days when it had been just her and the mocking silence, her and the desperate hope that a wild thing could be reached. "He taught me," she said softly. Svensson smiled his rare, knowing smile. He looked from her to the donkey and back again. "A stubborn heart speaks to a stubborn heart," he said, the words now a benediction, the fulfillment of a prophecy. "You see, the land knew you. The beast knew you. They were just waiting for you to listen." The sun set, painting the clouds in hues of rose and gold. Alara leaned against the porch rail, the wood smooth and familiar beneath her hands. The air was cool and clean, filled with the scent of wet earth and growing things. It was the smell of a promise kept. She was not the woman who had arrived with a single bag and a doubtful future. She was a part of this land, and it was a part of her. She had found her place not by conquering the wildness, but by having the patience to understand it and the wisdom to trust it. And in the quiet heart of her valley, surrounded by her flock and her friends, under the watchful eye of a ridiculous, magnificent donkey, she was finally home. She had learned the land's true language. It wasn't about ownership or dominance. It was about listening, about patience, and about the stubborn, unshakable belief that even the most scorned and desolate things held a value that only a willing heart could see, and that, she now knew, was an arithmetic that could save the world. The gentle rhythm of the farm settled into a new normal, one built on the foundations of shared trust. The seasons turned, and Alara's reputation grew beyond the valley. Other small ranchers from neighboring counties began to seek her out, not just for her fair prices, but for her advice. They would arrive dusty and hesitant, men who had worked the land their whole lives, to ask a young woman how she had managed to thrive where so many had failed. She never preached. She simply told them her story. She spoke of observation, of patience, of not mistaking what is for what could be. She told them about Jericho. Many of them would look over at the great, scarred donkey, now dozing in the sun, and shake their heads in disbelief. But they listened. They started looking at their own land differently, searching for the hidden springs, the overlooked assets. They learned to see a protector in a pest, an opportunity in a problem. Alara had not just saved a valley. She had planted an idea. Finn grew into a capable young man, his quiet nature blossoming into a steady confidence. He had a deep, intuitive understanding of the animals, a gift that Alara nurtured. He could calm a panicked ewe with a soft word, spot the first sign of illness before it took hold. He was her successor, the future of the ranch, and the entire valley knew it and was glad. The bond between the boy and the donkey remained a thing of quiet wonder. Finn was the only other person Jericho would allow close, the only one whose touch he would tolerate. They were two of a kind, a boy and a beast who had both found their sanctuary on Alara's land. One day, a finely dressed man from a big Eastern newspaper arrived. Having heard the whispers of the Donkey Queen of Promise Valley, he wanted to write a sensational story about the wild woman and her wolf-killing mule. He asked Alara a dozen questions about her bravery, her grit, her fight against the odds. She answered him politely, but steered the conversation away from herself. She talked about the importance of community, about Srenson's wisdom, about Jebediah's courage in asking for help. She talked about Finn's hard work. And most of all, she talked about Jericho, not as a weapon, but as a teacher. He already knew everything we needed to survive, she told the reporter, who scribbled furiously in his notepad. He knew where the water was, he knew how to be a guardian, and he knew who to trust. All I did was stop trying to make him into something he wasn't and start paying attention to what he already was. The article that was eventually published was not the sensational piece the reporter had probably intended to write. It was a quieter, more thoughtful story about a different kind of frontier spirit, one based not on conquest, but on cooperation. It was a story about how the most valuable things are often the ones we have already thrown away. It brought a new kind of visitor to the valley. Families looking for a place to build a life, people tired of the greed and competition of the wider world. The town of Promise began to live up to its name. Alara had never married. She had her land, her flock, her friends, and her work. Her life was full to the brim. She had forged a family not from blood, but from shared purpose and mutual respect. She grew older, her hands becoming as gnarled and strong as the roots of the cottonwood trees by the spring. Her hair grayed, but her eyes remained clear and observant. Jericho, too, aged. His muzzle turned white, his movements became slower, but his presence remained as formidable as ever. He was the old king of the valley, a living monument to the power of stubbornness and the wisdom of the wild. On the day he finally laid down in the sun-drenched pasture and did not get up again, the entire valley mourned with her. They buried him in the basin by the hidden spring, the place where she had first earned his trust. There was no stone, no marker. None was needed. The green valley, the healthy flocks, the thriving community, they were all his monument. Years later, when Alara was an old woman, a respected elder as wise as Srenson had been, a new crisis would come. A terrible blizzard, a sickness in the flocks, another fire or flood. And the people of the valley, her people, would turn to her. They would gather in her warm kitchen, and she would look into their worried faces, and she would tell them the story of a feral donkey nobody could catch, and of a lesson it had taken her a lifetime to truly understand. Look for the answer the land is already providing, she would say, her voice as soft and steady as the spring that still flowed in the hills. Find the thing that everyone else has overlooked. Be patient, be stubborn, and trust that even in the hardest of times, there is a guardian you have not yet learned to see, and they would listen. Because they knew she was right. They were living in the proof.